today I want to talk about the most important thing to me, the thing that is nearest and dearest to my heart. Judging my behavior, it's where I pour most of my effort. Me. I try to keep my shit together. I try to prevent my own death. I try to avoid discomfort and upset. I try to avoid poisons. I do all sorts of work to avoid ending myself. Now, I'm guessing the same is true for you. Not about me, but about you. That is, you may not even stay for the end of this video. I'm not the most important thing for you, but you are for you. I think that's how it is for us. We living beings are all, in this respect, selfish. That is, we are selves struggling for our own existence. Now, maybe you don't love yourself as much as you'd like to. Maybe you are not comfortable with your own skin, which is certainly a possibility. That is, maybe you're not happy with what you were born with. That happens for us a lot. But I don't think that means that you aren't putting effort into yourself. And if love takes effort, then I would say that that is what you love most. That is, you give the most effort to yourself, including effort to keep yourself comfortable in your own skin, despite not being entirely comfortable with your skin. And while we are very self-obsessed, and while we are trying to figure out what to do, what not to do, we don't spend much time or attention paying attention to what selves and trying actually are. So here's a question for you. What are you? What are you? And here are some popular answers. You are a spirit or a soul, some thing that's added to matter to make you come alive. Or if you want to get technical, you could say you are your appetite, your motivations, your consciousness. To me, those are not adequate answers. They don't actually explain what I am. They're like unexplained explanations that people rely on. What am I? I'm a self that gets embodied within my matter. Kind of like this ethereal non-thing that gets passed into me. Or maybe you could say, I'm my DNA. Or I'm the product of natural selection having chosen me. But I want to come back to this idea that I am trying to keep my shit together, because I think this is a better explanation for what I actually am and what keeps me trying, as I do, to keep me trying. To keep your shit together is to prevent yourself from falling apart. That's interesting. I think of myself as all of the preventions that I have accumulated throughout my life. That is, to keep myself the same-ish over the course of my life and over the 3.8 billion years that preceded me in life. It is preventions. If I prevent myself from falling apart, if I keep my shit together, I can maintain my existence. So what I am, at core, is a prevention. It's a prevention of my own ending. It's why I keep out certain things, let in other things, food, not toxins, good vibes, not bad vibes, that kind of thing. And the way that works for me is that the more you constrain or limit what's possible, the more similar you remain. That is, I remain the same self by preventing myself from becoming all sorts of other things. I have a term for it. The technical term for it is constraint. I am a constraint that channels energy into work to regenerate the constraint I am. But constraint is a funny word. It sounds like another thing. You know, a wall is a constraint. It keeps you from walking right through it. It limits your, what we call, degrees of freedom, what's possible. But a constraint, the kind of constraint I am, is different. I'm a fluid constraint. I'm not a solid, static constraint. I am changing all the time. But I'm changing within limits. I am the ulikelification of my own demise. That's what I think I am. I'm not a soul that gets added. I'm not a spirit. I'm not motivation. I am the way that I channel energy into work to regenerate myself. Which means work that prevents me from degenerating. And I think it's important we pay attention to that. One way that I think of it is that I am a clusterflux. That is, I'm a cluster, a variety of different possible movements, things changing, my beard growing, me trimming it off, a bump on my hand arrives and departs. That is, there's a lot of variety, but it's variety within a constrained potential. That is, that I maintain my own ulikelification of death, ulikelification of disappointment. All of these things that I do are actually best thought of not as something added to physics, but a restriction on physics, a way that I limit physics through checks and balances. Checks in balance, that is, a bunch of different parts of me, or processes in me, keeping each other in check. I don't think we love checks. That is, we don't like to be constrained. But we are ultimately a constraint. The only things that survive, the only fragile things that survive are checks in balance. This is true of organisms, this is true of organizations, this is true of partnerships, this is true of friendships, this is true of governments. So anytime you've got a fragile system that stays in existence, it is through checks in balance. And so I am a bunch of preventions that are preventing each other from ending. That's what I actually think I am. And I invite you to consider that as a possibility for what you are. Because it's an interesting approach. We're paying attention to what doesn't happen. Now, throughout the history of science, there have been major breakthroughs that come from paying attention to what doesn't happen. You know how we talk about bits and bytes of information? That is actually the definition of a bit of information is a reduction in possibilities. That is, some things were possible. Let's say with a coin flip, there's heads and tails, but then there's one actualization. That is, it comes up either heads or tails. That's considered a binary bit of information. It's going from two possibilities to one actuality. So if you think about that, that's actually about how constraint happens. That is a process of elimination. Here's another one. What I've got to explain myself from is the second law of thermodynamics, which is that whenever there are constraints, they tend to fall apart, as I will eventually. So what's our explanation for that? Because constraints are rare compared to randomness. So things tend to get mixed up. If they're moving around, they'll tend to get mixed up. That's the second law of thermodynamics. So a better term for it is the first law of everything, because that's kind of universal. That's what I'm working against most fundamentally, is the tendency for me to degenerate. If you imagine a dead body and how quickly it decays, how quickly it falls apart once it's dead, and then try imagining reversing that. That's an example of all the work I have to do to keep my shit together to prevent myself from ending. All that work going in the other direction is what I really am. And then Darwin, who didn't explain life. He didn't explain what selves are. He knew he hadn't explained that. He admitted it. He assumed selves struggling for their own existence. But still, what did he do? He paid attention to what happens and what doesn't happen, what gets prevented from happening. So what we call survival of the fittest is actually the non-survival of the unfit. So if you happen to be one of the rare individuals for whom what's nearest and dearest to your heart is yourself and your effort, consider this possibility, that you are a clusterflux that channels energy into the prevention of the clusterflux you are from ending. You are a constraint that channels energy into work to regenerate the constraint you are instead of all the other things that your chemistry could do. You are an ulikelification. And I work in research that tries to understand how an unlikelification like us could ever emerge from the unlikelying that happens in physics and chemistry. That is, it's very unlikely for a constraint to remain a constraint in nature. That is, it becomes more and more likely that it'll randomize. And here I am unlikelifying, which means that I'm actually doing the work to unlikelify my own death. So if you get beyond this question of self-obsession, what should you do, how do you try to figure out what to try to do, and try to understand what selves and trying actually are. And don't want to just resolve to what I'll call the path of least existence, which is just assuming something like I am consciousness or I am a spirit. Because those things, they're not physical things that exist. They're just unexplained explanations that people employ. If you want to get beyond that, consider the possibility that you are an unlikelification, that you are busy being a being, both a verb and a noun. You are busy being a being by unlikelifying your non-being. Now, I've got friends who say, Jeremy, you're so damn abstract. I don't think that's abstract. I think talking about me as a spirit or an agent or consciousness is extremely abstract. I think I'm offering something that's grounded in physics, and I invite you to consider it.